Space is not only the endless expanses of stars and planets, the romance of exploration and the triumph of human genius. It is also the most ruthless cemetery imaginable. A cemetery where instead of gravestones, there are fragments of spacecraft scattered on the surfaces of alien worlds. Where instead of wreaths, there is space dust settling on the remains of machines that were once the pinnacle of technology. And where among this cold silence lie those who dared to step outside their home planet and never returned. When we look at the starry sky, we rarely think about the fact that there, in this abyss, people's bodies are floating. Real human bodies, not in some science fiction films, but in reality. Right now, as you listen to these words, above our heads, in the cold void, drift the remains of astronauts and astronauts, forever sealed in their space suits or spaceships. Let's start with the most terrible story, a story that has been hidden from the public for a long time. In 1967, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die during a space flight. His Soyuz, one spacecraft, was doomed from the very beginning. Engineers knew about more than 200 malfunctions, but the political pressure was too strong. The USSR could not afford to lag behind America in the space race. Komarov knew that the flight would be his last. He understood this. They say he even demanded an open coffin at the funeral so that the leaders could see what they had done. When the ship began to descend, the parachute did not open. Komarov fell to the earth at a speed of almost 700 kilometers per hour. He spent the last minutes of his life cursing everyone who sent him to certain death. These words were recorded, but the tape was classified. When the capsule crashed into the ground, it turned into a burning metal ball. What was left of Komarov weighed about 30 kilograms of charred remains. But at least it returned to Earth. Not everyone is so lucky. Now imagine the moon. Yes, our romantic companion, whom lovers look at in the night sky. The moon is a gigantic graveyard of human achievements and failures. The remains of more than 100 spacecraft are now lying there. Its first inhabitant was the Soviet Luna 2 in 1959. It crashed into the surface at a speed of more than 3 kilometers per second. Dozens of others followed. American Rangers, which crashed into the lunar surface at full speed in order to have time to transmit a few photos before their death. Soviet Luna, many of which never fulfilled their mission. But the most terrible thing is that the remains of man also lie on the moon. More precisely, dust. When planetary scientist Eugene Shoemaker died in a car accident in 1997, his colleagues decided to send some of his ashes to the moon. The capsule with the ashes was placed aboard the Lunar Prospector spacecraft. In 1999, the spacecraft completed its mission and was deliberately sent to the moon. It crashed to the surface near the South Pole, and Shoemaker's ashes remained forever where he had always dreamed of visiting. He became the first and so far the only person whose ashes rest on another celestial body. But let's talk about the creepiest cosmic graveyard, Mars. A red planet that has been beckoning us for more than a century. A planet on which we dream of founding a colony. And it is already littered with the wreckage of our attempts to get to it. Mars is a real graveyard of ambitions. Of the more than 50 missions to Mars, less than half were successful. The rest turned into space debris or crashed on the Martian surface. Imagine this picture. You're standing on Mars. Around you is a red desert that stretches to the horizon. And if you could go around the entire planet, you'd stumble upon a whole graveyard of spacecraft. Here lies the Soviet Mars 3, the first device that made a soft landing on Mars in 1971. It worked for only 14 seconds, transmitting an indistinct signal, and fell silent forever. Next to him is his twin Mars 6, which crashed during landing. A little further on is the British Beagle 2, which successfully landed in 2003 but was never able to deploy its solar panels and died in silence before it could even signal that it was intact. But the creepiest sight on Mars is the Wreckage of Schiaparelli. It was a European lander that was supposed to land softly on the surface in 2016. Something went wrong with the computer. The device decided that it was already on the surface when in fact it was at an altitude of several kilometers. The engines turned off. Schiaparelli fell like a stone. It crashed into the Martian ground at a speed of more than 300 kilometers per hour and exploded, leaving a black spot on the surface and scattering debris hundreds of meters around. Orbiters photographed the crash site. The pictures show a dark spot from the explosion and a white. This is a parachute, which remained lying on the red sand. And there are also rovers on Mars. Yes, some of them are still working, but many are already dead. Spirit, a rover that operated 6 times longer than planned, was stuck in a sand trap in 2009. Engineers have been trying to free him for months, but to no avail. The Martian winter covered him. The solar panels were covered with dust. The temperature dropped so much that the electronics simply froze. The last signal from Spirit came on March 22, 2010. Since then, there has been silence. He's still standing there in this sand trap in the middle of the Martian desert. Its twin, Opportunity, lasted until 2018 when a Martian dust storm covered the entire planet. The storm was so strong that sunlight could not break through the dust. Opportunity's batteries are dead. Engineers sent wake-up commands more than 1,000 times. There was no answer. Somewhere in the Perseverance Valley, it still stands, covered in Martian dust, a silent monument to human perseverance. But do you know what is really scary? Not the dead machines themselves, but the fact that sometimes they show signs of life. In 2014, the Opportunity rover, which was thought to be almost dead after a long winter, suddenly came to life. In 2007, after several months of silence, the Soviet spacecraft Phobos 2, which was in orbit around Mars, unexpectedly got in touch. However, after a few days, he fell silent again forever. It's like the voices of ghosts in the void. Now let's talk about Venus, the most hellish planet in the solar system. If Mars is a cold desert, then Venus is literally hell. The temperature on the surface is about 470 degrees Celsius. The atmospheric pressure is 90 times greater than the Earth's, as at a depth of almost a kilometer underwater. The atmosphere consists of sulfuric acid. This is a place where lead melts and spacecraft die in a matter of minutes. The USSR was obsessed with Venus. Soviet engineers sent probes there over and over again, trying to land them on the surface. The first attempts were catastrophic. Venera, the 3 in 1966 became the first man-made object to reach another planet, but it crashed because communication with it was lost long before entering the atmosphere. Venera, was crushed by the monstrous pressure before it even reached the surface. Venera, 5 in Venera, 6 suffered the same fate. But the Soviet engineers did not give up. They built more and more durable devices, real titanium spheres capable of withstanding the pressure of the Venusian atmosphere. And finally, in 1970, Venera 7 did the impossible. It landed on the surface and transmitted data for 23 minutes. 23 minutes in hell. Then it melted and fell silent forever. Subsequent Soviet Venus worked a little longer, up to 2 hours. They even managed to take a few photos. These pictures show rocks covered with some kind of dark crust and a yellowish sky. These are the only photos from the surface of a planet other than Mars. And these photos were taken by dead vehicles that are now lying on the scorching surface of Venus, slowly collapsing in a hellish atmosphere. In total, the remains of more than 24 spacecraft lie on Venus. Soviet Venus and Vega, American pioneers. They're all dead. All of them slowly dissolve in sulfuric acid and melt under a monstrous temperature. This is the hottest cemetery in the solar system. And now, let's go back to space, into the cold void between the planets, because it is there that the most terrible graves are located. I'm talking about cosmonauts and astronauts who died in space and whose bodies remain there. Vladimir Komarov, whom I have already talked about, at least returned to Earth. But there were others. In 1971, cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev became crew members of the Salyut 1 orbital station. They spent 23 days on the station, setting a record for staying in space. Everything was going well. They returned home as heroes. But during the descent, something went wrong. The ventilation valve opened prematurely. At an altitude of more than 100 kilometers, air began to escape from the capsule. The cosmonauts tried to close the valve manually, but it was located in such a way that it was impossible to reach it without unfastening the belts. And it took time to unfasten the belts and try to close the valve, time that they did not have. The pressure in the capsule dropped rapidly. A few seconds later, they lost consciousness. A minute later, they were dead. The capsule continued to descend on autopilot. When the search team opened the hatch, they found 3 bodies. On the faces of the cosmonauts, there were traces of blood from the noses and ears. Their eyes were open. They died in space, although technically their bodies returned to Earth. But the most terrible story is associated with the disaster of the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003. 7 astronauts were returning home after a successful mission. When entering the atmosphere at a speed of more than 20,000 kilometers per hour, the shuttle began to break up. The heat shielding tiles were damaged during takeoff, but no one knew how seriously. Hot plasma began to penetrate into the wing. The shuttle became uncontrollable. It exploded into pieces at an altitude of about 60 kilometers. The astronauts were alive when the shuttle began to break up. They were conscious. Investigators found evidence that some of them tried to activate emergency systems. This means that they understood what was happening. They knew they were dying. Their bodies fell from the sky along with the wreckage of the shuttle, scattered for hundreds of kilometers across Texas and Louisiana. It took months for rescuers to collect the remains. Some fragments were never found. And what about the Challenger disaster in 1986? 7 astronauts, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, soared under the gaze of millions. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle exploded. For a long time, it was believed that the crew died instantly. But the investigation revealed something terrifying. The cockpit survived the explosion. It did not collapse. It just broke away from the rest of the shuttle and started falling. The astronauts were alive. Some of them managed to activate their personal oxygen reserves, which means that they were conscious. They fell for almost 3 minutes from a height of 15 kilometers. 3 minutes to realize that you are dying. The cabin crashed into the ocean at a speed of more than 300 kilometers per hour. The impact was so strong that it was tantamount to colliding with a concrete wall. But there are even more terrible stories. Stories that have never been officially confirmed, but are whispered in the corridors of space agencies. The story of the lost cosmonauts, Soviet cosmonauts who allegedly died in space before Yuri Gagarin, but these missions were never officially reported. The Giudica Cordilla brothers, Italian radio amateurs, claimed in the late 1950s and early 1960s that they had intercepted signals from Soviet spacecraft. In November 1960, they recorded an SOS signal in Russian. In February 1961, the sounds of a rapid heartbeat, which then slowed down and stopped. In May 1961, a female voice in Russian shouted about entering the atmosphere, that it was getting hot, that the ship was on fire. Then there was silence. The USSR denied these recordings, but the fact remains, many Soviet cosmonauts were crossed out of the official lists of the Cosmonaut Corps without explanation. Valentin Bondarenko died during training in a hyperbaric chamber in 1961. His death was reported only in 1986. Grigory Nelyubov was expelled from the Cosmonaut Corps for drunkenness and later died after being hit by a train. But some believe that he managed to fly into space and something went wrong. Are these stories true? We'll probably never know. But the very possibility that somewhere in space the bodies of unknown astronauts, whose names have been erased from history, are drifting is particularly terrifying. And now let's talk about the most distant cosmic graveyard, the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. They are among millions of stone debris. Several spacecraft are drifting. Japan's Hayabusa barely made it back in 2010, but its predecessors weren't as lucky. Farther away, beyond the orbit of Jupiter, lie even more distant graves. Galileo is an American probe that studied Jupiter and its moons from 1995 to 2003. When its mission ended, NASA decided to destroy the spacecraft, sending it into the atmosphere of Jupiter. Why? Because Galileo had a radioisotope battery on board, and there was a risk that someday, many years from now, the spacecraft could fall on the moon Europa, which may have life in the subglacial ocean. In order not to pollute the potential living world with terrestrial microorganisms, the Galileo was sent to its death. It entered Jupiter's atmosphere at a speed of almost 50 kilometers per second and burned up in a matter of seconds. The same thing happened with the Cassini probe in 2017. For 13 years, he studied Saturn, its rings and moons. He made amazing discoveries, geysers on Enceladus, methane lakes on Titan. But when the fuel ran out, it too was sent to its death, sent into Saturn's atmosphere. Cassini transmitted data until the last second, and then burned up, becoming part of the planet it studied. This is a special kind of space burial, deliberate destruction to protect other worlds from pollution. Strange, isn't it? We build these incredible machines, send them on a journey of billions of kilometers. They serve us for years, and then we intentionally kill them by burning them in the atmospheres of alien planets. But the most distant graves are outside the solar system. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 are the only man-made objects that have left our solar system. They were launched in 1977 and are still in operation, although their systems are gradually shutting down one by one. But what happens when they finally die? They will continue to drift in interstellar space. In tens of thousands of years, they will fly past other stars. Millions of years from now, they will still be flying through the void, dead and cold, carrying gold plates with a message from humanity, a message from a civilization that may not exist by then. These will be the most enduring monuments to humanity. Not pyramids, not statues, but two small spacecraft flying through eternity. Now let's talk about orbital space debris. It's a real graveyard around the Earth. There, in orbit, debris of more than 9,000 tons of space debris is flying. This is not just a number. These are tens of thousands of objects larger than 10 centimeters and millions of small fragments. Among them are fragments of satellites, entire dead satellites, rocket upper stages, instruments lost by astronauts during spacewalks. In 2009, the first ever collision of two satellites in orbit occurred. The Russian military satellite Cosmos 2251, dead and uncontrollable, crashed into a working American commercial satellite, Iridium-33. The collision occurred at an altitude of about 800 kilometers above Siberia, at a speed of more than 11 kilometers per second. Both satellites shattered into thousands of fragments. This debris now flies in orbit, posing a danger to other satellites and space stations. And in 2021, Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon, destroying its own old satellite. One explosion, and another 1,500 fragments flying at the speed of a bullet. Astronauts on the ISS had to take refuge in descent capsules in case one of the debris pierced the station. Imagine, you are in space, in a thin-walled module, and thousands of debris are flying around you at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. Even a tiny pea-sized fragment at this speed has the energy of a grenade. A direct hit on a space station or an astronaut spacesuit during a spacewalk would be catastrophic. And this problem will only get worse. Scientists talk about Kessler syndrome, a cascading reaction when collisions create more and more debris that causes new collisions. At some point, low Earth orbit could become so clogged that spaceflight would become too dangerous. We may find ourselves trapped on our own planet, surrounded by a cloud of dead satellites and their debris. Among all this garbage, there are especially creepy objects. For example, lost tools. In 2008, astronaut Heidemarie Stephanischen Piper dropped a bag of instruments worth about $100,000 during a spacewalk from the International Space Station. The bag flew into space. For several months, it could be seen from Earth through amateur telescopes. A bright that was once someone's work inventory and now has become space junk. Eventually, it entered the atmosphere and burned up. In 1965, astronaut Edward White lost his glove during the first American spacewalk. The spacesuit glove became the most expensive space debris of its time. It flew in orbit for about a month, moving at a speed of about 28,000 kilometers per hour before it burned up in the atmosphere. Imagine a glove flying in the emptiness of space. A terrible sight if you think about it. Now let's go back to the moon and talk about what the American astronauts left there during the Apollo program. These are not just flags and footprints. This is a whole cemetery of human activity. 6 landers remained on the moon, the lower stages that served as launch pads for the return of astronauts to orbit. They still stand there, on their legs, slowly covered with micrometeorite dust. Next to them are 3 lunar mobiles, electric cars that astronauts drove on the lunar surface. They stand where they were last left. The batteries are long dead. The rubber of the wheels has probably collapsed from cosmic radiation and extreme temperature changes. But they're still there. Can you imagine? Cars on the moon. They just stand in the moon dust, as if in some abandoned parking lot. The astronauts left a lot of other things there. Scientific instruments, some of which worked for years after people flew away. Tools, bags of human excrement. Yes, it's true. They left bags of waste to reduce their weight on takeoff, cameras, flags, plaques, medals of the dead astronauts. One of the most touching objects on the moon is a small aluminum figurine called the fallen astronaut. It was left by the crew of Apollo 15 in 1971 in memory of all the astronauts and cosmonauts who died in the space race. Next to the figurine is a plaque with the names of 14 people, 8 Americans and 6 Soviet cosmonauts. This is a small monument on the surface of the moon that no one ever visits. And there is also a family photo on the moon. Astronaut Charles Duke from the Apollo 16 crew left a photo of his family in a plastic bag on the lunar surface. He himself told about it later. Imagine a family photo on the moon. By now, it's probably faded from the sun's ultraviolet light beyond recognition, but it's still there. A strange, slightly sad artifact of human sentimentality on a dead world. Let's now talk about more modern space cemeteries. About the so-called space cemetery in the Pacific Ocean. Officially, it is called Point Nemo, the farthest place from any land on Earth. It is located in the South Pacific Ocean at a distance of more than 2,500 kilometers from the nearest coast. And it was there that end-of-life space stations and large satellites were dropped for decades. At the bottom of the ocean in the area of Point Nemo lie the wreckage of more than 300 spacecraft. The remains of the Progress cargo ships, European ATV automatic cargo ships, and Japanese HTV trucks rest there. There are parts of Soviet and Russian space stations of the Salyut series. And the largest object in this underwater cemetery is the Mir orbital station. Mir was the pride of Soviet and Russian cosmonautics. It worked in orbit for 15 years, from 1986 to 2001. It was visited by cosmonauts from many countries. It was home to people in space. But by 2001, the station was outdated. It became more and more expensive and dangerous to maintain its work. It was decided to deorbit it. On March 23, 2001, Mir began its last journey. Special engines slowed down the station, and it began to descend. When it entered the dense layers of the atmosphere, a real fire show began. A 130-ton space station burning, breaking apart, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Most of the station burned up in the atmosphere, but large debris, about 1,500 fragments weighing about 20 tons, fell into the Pacific Ocean near Point Nemo. Oceanologists say that at a depth of several kilometers, in complete darkness and under monstrous pressure, lie the wreckage of a human home in space. Modules covered with shells and algae. The portholes through which the astronauts looked at the Earth and the stars now look into the eternal darkness of the ocean abyss. And soon another large object will join this debris. International Space Station. The ISS has been operating since 2000, but its service life is coming to an end. Sometime in the late 2020s or early 2030s, it too will be deorbited and sunk at Point Nemo. It will be the end of an era. The largest and most expensive object ever built by mankind in space, weighing more than 400 tons, larger than a football field, will be a pile of debris at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And now let's talk about a completely different kind of space cemetery. About the cemetery of hopes and ambitions. There are numerous spacecraft that have been launched but never reached their destination. They didn't crash spectacularly. They just disappeared, lost in the void. Phobos Grunt is a Russian probe that in 2011 was supposed to go to the Martian satellite Phobos, take soil samples, and return Earth. It was an ambitious mission that was supposed to restore the prestige of Russian cosmonautics. But immediately after separating from the rocket, something went wrong. The engines did not start. The device remained in low Earth orbit. Engineers tried to contact him, give commands, revive him. Unsuccessfully, For 2 weeks, Phobos Grunt was silent, slowly losing altitude, and then it entered the atmosphere and fell into the Pacific Ocean. The mission, worth billions of rubles, turned into a pile of debris at the bottom of the ocean, never reaching Earth orbit. The Japanese probe Nozomi was supposed to be the first Japanese device in orbit around Mars. It was launched in 1998. For 5 years, he flew to the Red Planet, overcoming technical problems one after another. But when it finally reached Mars in 2003, it turned out that there wasn't enough fuel to get into orbit. Nozomi flew past Mars and went into orbit around the sun somewhere out there in the cosmic void. He is still flying, dead, silent, forever doomed to circle the sun without completing his mission. The British probe Beagle 2, which I have already mentioned, is a particularly tragic story. In 2003, it successfully landed on Mars, but there was no communication. For more than 10 years, nothing was known about him. It was believed that it crashed. But in 2015, the orbiter was able to photograph the landing site with high resolution. The Beagle 2 was there, safe and sound. It's just that its solar panels didn't fully open. They blocked the antenna. The device worked, but could not transmit a signal. He was lying on Mars, perhaps trying to call for help, but no one could hear him. And at some point, the batteries died, and he died in silence, just a few centimeters from success. It's especially cruel, isn't it? When the device has almost completed its mission, almost succeeded, but some tiny technical glitch turns it into another piece of space debris. But let's talk about the darkest prospect, about what awaits us in the future if we really start colonizing other planets. Because there will definitely be real cemeteries on Mars or the Moon, real graves with human bodies. If we establish permanent bases on the Moon or Mars, people will die there. From accidents, from diseases, from old age, if the colony exists long enough. And they cannot be sent back to Earth. Transportation is too expensive. The bodies will have to be buried there. How are people buried on the Moon? Is it possible to just dig a hole in lunar regolith? But there is no air, no bacteria. Bodies will not decompose. They will lie in a vacuum, mummified, forever preserved. Or will they be cremated? But cremation requires oxygen, and oxygen on the Moon is more expensive than gold. And on Mars? There is an atmosphere there, albeit rarefied. But it is so cold and dry that the bodies will also mummify instead of decomposing. Imagine a Martian graveyard, rows of tombstones in red dust. The names of the first settlers who lived and died on an alien planet, millions of kilometers from home, who have never seen rain, never felt the wind, never walked on the grass. And these people will definitely be there. If we are serious about colonizing space, we must accept the fact that we will create cemeteries on other worlds, that some of our descendants will be buried not on Earth, but on another planet, that their graves would look not at the earthly sky, but at someone else's, where the Earth is just a bright dot among the stars. Do you know what's the creepiest thing about space cemeteries? Their eternity. On Earth, everything is temporary. Monuments are destroyed, graves are overgrown, even pyramids slowly disintegrate under the influence of wind and rain. But there is no wind in space, no rain. There is no erosion other than the slow impact of micrometeorites and cosmic radiation. The shoe footprint left by Neil Armstrong on the Moon in 1969 is still there. It will be there for millions of years to come until some meteorite accidentally falls into this very place. The flags that the astronauts planted on the Moon probably faded from the sun's ultraviolet light, turning into white rags, but they still stand. The bodies of Eugene Shoemaker on the moon and Clyde Tombaugh, whose ashes were sent to Pluto on the New Horizons probe, will lie on these worlds longer than human civilization will exist. This is a kind of immortality, isn't it? Painful, cold immortality. These people, these machines will survive everything. They will become archaeological artifacts of the future when millions of years from now, intelligent beings, maybe our descendants, maybe aliens, will find them and wonder, who are these beings who were able to break free from their planet and scatter their footprints throughout the solar system? But for now, these cemeteries are silent. Spirit and Opportunity are in their final positions on Mars, covered in dust, their systems long dead. Venus are slowly dissolving in the hellish atmosphere of Venus. Moonmobiles stand on the moon. Their wheels will never turn again. The wreckage of the Mir lies at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in eternal darkness. And somewhere in interstellar space, the Voyagers are flying farther and farther from home, which they will never see again. And you know what the saddest thing is? Every year, there are more and more of these cemeteries. With each new mission, we add new objects to this grim list. Perseverance is currently working on Mars, but one day it will fall silent. James Webb is now showing us incredible photos of distant galaxies, but someday its fuel will run out and it will become another piece of dead iron drifting at the Lagrange point. We build more and more complex machines, send them farther and farther away, but the end is always the same, a cold death in the void. And for people who risk their lives to explore space, the end could be even darker. Death in a sealed capsule, suffocating in carbon dioxide, or slow freezing after depressurization, or instant evaporation when entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speed. Space does not forgive mistakes. It does not give a second chance. One faulty valve and 3 cosmonauts are dead. One damaged heat-shielding tile and 7 astronauts turn into a rain of debris. One mistake in the program and the billion-dollar mission becomes a pile of metal on the surface of an alien planet. And despite this, we continue. We continue to send people and machines into space. We continue to take risks, to explore, to try to achieve the impossible. And in the process, we're creating these horrific monuments, cemeteries on other worlds, debris in a vacuum, bodies in the void. Maybe this is the real price of progress. These cosmic cemeteries are not failures, not defeats. These are monuments to courage. Every dead craft on Mars is a lesson for the next mission. Each cosmonaut who died is a reminder of how dangerous our path to the stars is. And every piece of debris in orbit is a trace of our presence in the universe, proof that we were here, that we tried. And someday, maybe hundreds or thousands of years from now, when we build cities on Mars and bases on the moons of Jupiter, when space travel becomes commonplace, people will come to these places as historical monuments. They will stand at the first dead rover and remember how it all began. They will look at the wreckage of the first ships and think about those who dared first. These will be sacred places, places of pilgrimage, as we now come to the places of the first flights of the Wright brothers or to the launch pads of Baikonur and Cape Canaveral. But this is still a long way off. In the meantime, space cemeteries are silent and lonely. On Mars, Spirit stands in its sand trap, covered in red dust, its cameras looking up at the Martian sky, but seeing nothing else. On Venus, Soviet Venuses are slowly turning into molten metal at a monstrous temperature. On the moon, The flag planted by Apollo 11 has probably already turned into a white rag, faded by solar ultraviolet. And somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, at a depth of several kilometers, in complete darkness, lies the wreckage of Mir, an entire space station, home to many people, now covered with shells and shrouded in darkness. And this, in the end, makes us think about our place in the universe. We do not create these cemeteries out of a desire to litter the cosmos or leave scars on other worlds. We create them because we can't do otherwise, because it is in our nature to explore, to achieve, to overcome, even if it means leaving a trail of wreckage and dead cars. You know, there's something deeply human about these cosmic cemeteries. They tell a story not about our successes, but about our attempts. It's about how we've tried to achieve the impossible over and over again, failed, learned from our mistakes, and tried again. Every dead craft on Mars is a chapter in the book of human perseverance. Every piece of debris in orbit is a paragraph in our history of survival and exploration. And the most striking thing is that we're just getting started. Right now, NASA is planning a mission to return samples from Mars. China is building its own space station and plans to send humans to the moon. Private companies are developing rockets for flights to Mars. We're talking about setting up bases on the moon, mining asteroids, terraforming Mars. And each of these missions will add new objects to the space cemeteries, because it is impossible to explore space without losses. The statistics are merciless. About every second mission to Mars ends in failure. And the more ambitious our plans become, the greater the risk. When we send humans to Mars, and this will happen perhaps as early as the 2030s, the probability of tragedy will be significant. The flight will last at least 6 months one way. 6 months in a tiny capsule where any malfunction can be fatal. 6 months of cosmic radiation from which there is no protection. 6 months in complete isolation where help from Earth is not possible. And then there's the Mars landing, which remains one of the most dangerous moments of any mission. The famous 7 minutes of terror, when the device enters the Martian atmosphere at hypersonic speed and must slow down from 20,000 kilometers per hour to 0 in a matter of minutes. It is impossible to control this process from Earth. The signal goes to Mars for at least 4 minutes. By the time Earth knows what's going on, it's all over. Either a successful landing or a disaster. And if something goes wrong, if the engines don't work or the parachute doesn't open, the first humans to go to Mars will be its first permanent inhabitants. Their bodies will remain there in a crashed capsule forever. And in years, when the next expeditions reach the red planet, they will find this place. Maybe they will erect a monument there. Maybe they will turn it into a memorial. The first human cemetery on another planet. But even if the first mission is successful, death cannot be avoided. Imagine a colony on Mars in 20, 30 years. Hundreds of people live there, work, explore the planet. And some of them will die from the accident, depressurization of the spacesuit, accident of the all-terrain vehicle, collapse of the tunnel. From illness, medical care on Mars will be limited. Surgeries that are considered routine on Earth can be fatal there. Or maybe just from old age, if someone lives there long enough. And what to do with the bodies? Take it back to Earth. It will cost millions of dollars per body. Unreal. Cremate? Cremation requires oxygen, and oxygen is the most valuable resource on Mars. Every liter of oxygen spent on cremation is oxygen that the living cannot breathe. Bury? But how? In Martian soil, which is so toxic due to perchlorates that nothing living can grow in it. Perhaps they will create special crypto storages, temperature-controlled rooms where bodies will be kept frozen. Martian morgue, rows of capsules containing the bodies of the first colonists who lived and died on an alien planet. This will be the darkest place in the colony, a place where people will come to remember those who did not return home. And there will also be lost ones, those who went on a research expedition and did not return. Mars is huge. Its surface area is equal to the area of the entire land area of the Earth. If someone gets lost in the Martian desert, if the rover breaks down far from the base, if a sandstorm covers the expedition, search parties will search, but Mars is ruthless. The body may remain where it fell, covered with red sand, and it may not be found for years. Or maybe they will never find it. Somewhere in Valles Marineris or on the slopes of Mount Olympus, skeletons in spacesuits will lie, silent witnesses to how far humanity has come and the price it has paid. The same awaits us on other worlds if we get to them. Jupiter's moons are Europa with its subglacial ocean where life can exist. Titan, a moon of Saturn with its methane lakes and thick atmosphere. If we send people there, some of them will die there. Someone will drown in a methane lake on Titan. Someone will fall through the ice on Europa. Someone would be crushed by the monstrous gravity if they tried to descend into Jupiter's atmosphere. And these deaths will be even worse because these worlds are so far away. The signal from Earth to Saturn takes more than an hour. If something goes wrong, the astronauts will be completely alone. No help, no escape, only the cold emptiness of space and the slow realization that you're dying billions of kilometers from home. And then think about interstellar travel. If we ever get to other stars, and that journey will take decades, even centuries, entire generations of humans will be born and die aboard spacecraft. They will never see the Earth. They will never feel the gravity of the planet. Their only home is a metal tube flying through the interstellar void. And when they die, will they be buried? There is limited space on the ship. Perhaps the bodies will be thrown into space. A cosmic funeral is a body wrapped in a shroud, thrown out through an airlock. It will drift in interstellar space forever, gradually moving away from the ship. In years, it will freeze to a temperature close to absolute zero. Centuries from now, it will still fly, mummified by the cosmic cold, impeccably preserved. And millions of years from now, when the ship has long since reached its destination, when the civilization that sent it may have ceased to exist, these bodies will still be flying through the void. The loneliest graves in the universe. But guess what? Despite all this horror, despite all these gloomy prospects, we will still fly. Because it is in human nature to strive for the stars. Even knowing about the risks. Even realizing that many will not return. The history of mankind is the history of explorers who went into the unknown, knowing that they might not return. Polynesians crossing the Pacific Ocean in flimsy canoes. Vikings sailing across the Atlantic, not knowing what is beyond the horizon. Arctic explorers freezing in an icy desert. Climbers dying on the slopes of Everest. Space is just the next frontier. More dangerous, more ruthless, but still a line that we must cross. And space cemeteries are the price of this journey. A price we seem willing to pay. And maybe thousands of years from now, when humanity is spread throughout the solar system, when space travel becomes as commonplace as air travel is today, these cemeteries will become places of pilgrimage. People will fly to Mars to see the first device that crashed there. They will stand at the graves of the first colonists who died on an alien planet. They will look at the wreckage of the Schiaparelli or at the spirit frozen in the sand and remember how it all began, how humanity took its first uncertain steps towards the stars. These places will become sacred. How we look today at the first planes of the Wright brothers, at the Vostok capsule, in which Gagarin made the first flight into space on the lunar module Apollo 11. These are not just pieces of metal. These are symbols. Symbols of human courage, perseverance, willingness to risk everything in order to find out what is beyond the next horizon. And the bodies of those who died in space or on other planets will not be forgotten. Their names will be recorded in history. Children will be told about them. They will be remembered as pioneers, as those who paid the highest price for our future among the stars. But so far, these cemeteries are silent. Dust settles on the solar panels of dead rovers. The temperature on Venus is slowly melting the Soviet probes. Flags on the moon fade under ultraviolet light. Debris flies in Earth orbit, threatening living satellites. And somewhere in interstellar space, the Voyagers are moving further and further away from home, to which they will never return. Space does not forgive mistakes. It does not give a second chance. He is ruthless and indifferent to human ambitions. But that's what makes our achievements in space so amazing. We, fragile creatures from a planet covered in water, where the temperature almost never drops below -50 and does not rise above +50. We have found a way to survive in an environment where the temperature ranges from -270 to plus a few million degrees, where there is no air, no water, nothing that supports life. We've sent our machines to other planets. They put people on the moon. They created a station that has been continuously inhabited for a quarter of a century. And yes, we left behind cemeteries. Cemeteries of cars and sometimes people. But these cemeteries are not a sign of defeat. It's a sign that we've tried, that we did not give up, that even in the face of cosmic infinity and our own insignificance, we continued to move forward. Every dead craft on Mars teaches us something new. Spirits stuck in the sand. Subsequent rovers received improved wheels and a better navigation system. Did Schiaparelli crash? The Europeans have revised the software of the landing system. Phobos Grunt could not reach the trajectory to Mars. Engineers figured out what went wrong and took it into account in future projects. And most importantly, we remember those who died. Vladimir Komarov, Yuri Gagarin, who died in a plane crash during a training flight. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, Viktor Patsayev, the crews of the Challenger and Columbia. Their names are forever inscribed in the history of space exploration. They did not just die. They gave their lives for our future among the stars. And when we look at these cosmic graveyards, the silent craft on Mars, the wreckage at Point Nemo, the plaques on the moon, we should remember that. This is not garbage. This is not waste. These are monuments. Monuments to a human spirit that refuses to accept limitations, that insists on exploring, understanding, reaching new heights, even knowing the risks. Space is full of dangers. He killed many. He will kill many more. But we will fly anyway. Because the alternative to stay on Earth, look at the stars, and only dream is unbearable. It is better to try and fail than not to try at all. It's better to leave your mark on another planet, even if it's your own body in a crashed ship, than to live your life without risking. And so space cemeteries will grow every year with each new mission. But our achievements will also grow. We are learning. We're getting better. The percentage of successful missions is growing. Technology is improving. What was impossible 10 years ago is becoming routine today. The day will come, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 50, when the first man will set foot on the surface of Mars. And at this moment in history, it is worth remembering all those who made it possible. About the dead rovers that mapped the planet. About the crash landers that taught us how not to do it. About the cosmonauts and astronauts who died paving the way. About nameless engineers who worked on projects that failed, but whose mistakes became lessons for others. The moment the first man stands on Mars, looking at the pink sky and red deserts, he will stand on the shoulders of giants. Not only the great scientists and astronauts whose names we all know, but all those who failed. Because in space, failure is not the end. This is a lesson. This is a step toward success. And space cemeteries are a library of these lessons, written not in ink on paper, but in metal and silicon on alien worlds. Every dead apparatus is a head. Every disaster is a paragraph. And together, they tell the story of how humanity learned to overcome the biggest barrier of all, the barrier between our homeworld and the infinity of space. So when you look at the night sky, at the stars and planets, think of cosmic cemeteries. That there, in the cold void, among the red sands of Mars, on the scorching surface of Venus, in the eternal darkness of the oceanic abyss on Earth, rest our first attempts to reach the stars. And know that these sacrifices were not in vain. Each of them has brought us closer to the day when humanity will become a truly interplanetary species, when we will live not only on Earth, but also on other worlds, when space ceases to be alien and hostile and becomes our home. And on that day, space cemeteries will remain, as a reminder, as a warning, and as a monument to all those who dared to be the first to step into the unknown and paid the highest price for it. They are not forgotten. They will never be forgotten, because without them, humanity would have no future among the stars.